Welcome to Whole Health. We're happy you're here on this journey of exploration with us as we learn what it means to live a life dedicated to spiritual, mental, and physical health. Before we begin our program, we want to share a brief legal disclaimer. The information provided on this program, including any health-related advice or discussions, is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making any decisions regarding your health. Now, let's turn it over to Pastor Jeremy, Dr. Kala Kleen, and Brittany Pfeifner for today's episode of Whole Health.
Welcome back to Whole Health. Today, we're talking about inflammation, but not just in the way most people think about, because inflammation is often seen as something negative, something to get rid of, but in reality, inflammation is one of the body's primary ways of protecting you. It's the body doing what it was designed to do. And I think that matters because the way we view the body shapes how we care for it. Scripture talks about the body as something intentional, designed with purpose, not randomly put together. And when we start to see symptoms, not just as problems, but as signals, it shifts our focus. We move from fighting the body to understanding it, supporting it. And today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to unpack what inflammation actually is, what drives it, especially in the gut, and how it connects to hormones, fertility, metabolism, brain health, and really long-term health as a whole. And so, Dr. Kala, why don't you start us off by explaining what inflammation actually is?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So at a foundational level, inflammation is part of your innate immune system. And innate immune system, a lot of times in chiropractic and healthcare, we talk about like, what is your innate ability? And that's God-given. We sweat when we're hot, we shiver when we're cold.
Right.
I know we've said a couple times in this podcast of find me a better man-made machine compared to the human
100%.
body, right? It does not exist. So this was designed by God as your body's immediate response network. When something is perceived as a threat, whether that's a pathogen, damaged tissue, toxins, or even an internal metabolic stress, the immune system releases some signaling molecules, and those are called cytokines. Some of the main ones, and they can be called cytokines or biomarkers, but measurable things are, for instance, interleukin-6. Now, that's just one. We have interleukin-6, 8, 24, 48. There's a lot of different interleukins, so you can Google that later and self-educate.
I want to do that 100%.
Tumor necrosis factor alpha, C-reactive protein. So C-reactive protein is probably the most common one that we see. Conventional healthcare or a lot of functional medicine providers are testing that one specifically as an entry-level baseline, but it's a non-specific. You can have C-reactive protein basic or C-reactive protein high sensitivity. There's different methodologies on how those numbers are calculated. Ideally, the lowest number you can have, closer to zero, the better, the reduced inflammation. But again, if somebody shows up to our office and we see a CRP of 3 or a CRP 11 or a CRP of 30, we don't know what the root cause of that is just based on that level.
Sure.
So again, this is just one of many biomarkers of inflammation, cytokines that can be signaled for many different reasons. However, these signals coordinate a response. They can increase blood flow. They can recruit different immune cells. The higher they get, we can have what's called an increased permeability. And we can have permeability, so we talk about leaky gut. That's kind of the most common one. In conventional healthcare, how you test leaky gut or permeability is based on zonulin. Zonulin and calprotectin and secretory IgA. Those are some of those different biomarkers. But, 15, 20 years ago when I was first in chiropractic, people would say, well, I went to quackwatch.com and heard leaky gut is like quackery and, witchcraft. Ironically, it's not, and it has been proven. And if you go to pubmed.gov and type in intestinal permeability, that is now very common nomenclature. But for many years, naturopaths, chiropractors have been talking about leaky gut, but the more common term now is called intestinal permeability. But we can get permeability of the blood-brain barrier. We can get permeability of the immune response. We can get permeability of even like the oral. So our immune system can actually start between like our eyelashes are actually part of our immune system.
Really?
Our nasal hair is part of our immune system. Even like saliva, like this is a barrier protection. like we start tearing up when we get a pathogen or a
Sure.
burden, and that's part of our immune system trying to block a pathogen from getting into the eyes. So
Love
we
that.
we have a beautiful, again, God created
I was gonna
immune
say his
system.
design is so great.
Yeah,
Wow.
so wild. But this is so when we have these things that increase permeability, which allows the immune systems to enter the tissue, and then that can start initiating rapport. But this is what we call an acute inflammation. And I want to be clear. Too much inflammation, chronic inflammation is a problem, but acute inflammation can be very beneficial and protective.
Sure.
It's essential and highly organized. Without it, we would not heal. And what's important that it's meant to be self-limiting. There's a built-in resolution phase involving anti-inflammatory cytokines, regulatory T cells, specialized mediators. And the problems start when the system stays turned on for too long. And then sometimes what happens if they've been turned on for too long, that weakening or that dampening of that immune system then limits it to then fight some of the more aggressive bacteria, viruses, and then some of the things that can develop into cancers and fuel to
Wow.
metabolic disease. So instead of being targeted, temporary, and resolving, it becomes this chronic and systemic. And this type of inflammation often doesn't feel obvious at first. Instead of a strong, short and intense response, you get continuous signaling, ongoing activation, and subtle tissue damage over time. This affects insulin receptor sensitivity and signaling, mitochondrial efficiency, hormone communication, and more. There has been a new major review in Nature Medicine that was published in 2019 that describes this chronic inflammation as a key driver of aging and nearly every chronic disease that can
Wow.
lead to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, and neurodegeneration. So inflammation isn't just something that shows up, it's something that drives what shows up. And so one of the biggest things that we see in our line of work when we have food sensitivities or food allergies, a lot of times people, they can silently suffer well
Sure.
with minor irritations. And so what we see is like, oh, every time I eat dairy, I know I got to go to the bathroom within 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Or every time I get exposure to this, but it doesn't affect necessarily a greater quality of their life.
Sure.
However, in our line of work, we're like, well, just because you can tolerate it doesn't mean that that's a good thing over time. So I love using my older brother as an example in this. We did a food intolerance. Both him and my sister-in-law wanted to do the food sensitivity test. Send them the kits, they poke their fingers, send the results in. Naturally, my sister-in-law has like 2 minor food
Oh, wow.
sensitivities, where my brother, his food sensitivities were all over the roof,
Right.
right? And very
Sounds like
high.
mine.
Yeah, and very high in dairy, egg, peanut, and like the gluten and the grains. And he calls me because they live in Washington State, and he's like, what does this mean? I didn't even feel that bad, but
Right.
now I am hijacked that
Right.
this is going to be a problem. Am I going to die of this? And ultimately is what we see is like, well, Jake, you can keep eating all of these foods that we know your immune system is hijacked by.
Right.
But the more chronic exposure you have, that's going to create that intestinal permeability, and that's going to be the fuel to other metabolic diseases, potentially something simple, just like osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, where you have the joint pain, achy pain, could fuel GI imbalance, fungal, bacteria. But the more time that goes unaddressed and he gets that chronic, constant burden, that actually then makes his immune system less likely to be able to fight the bigger threats, meaning when the T cells and the immune system from like an anti-cancer, anti-metabolic disease standpoint, that can then have the negative consequence. So again, there's a lot of different ways that inflammation can be minor, but I can manage versus is that the fuel to greater things down the road?
Right. I think what stands out to me is how intentional the system is. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. When it's working the way it was designed to, it's perfect. And what we're really talking about isn't the presence of inflammation then, it's the loss of resolution. And I think one of the biggest places that begins to happen is in the gut. And so, Brittany, can you maybe explain to us the gut's role in all of this?
Absolutely. Like Kyla was saying, she gave like a pretty good overview of some
Yeah,
of
that's
the complications of things that can happen when your immune system is overly activated all the time. But so your gut is, I know we've talked about this past, your gut is one of the most influential regulators of pretty much everything. Like if you come to our office, we're going to talk about your gut health, like
Right.
foundationally. Doesn't matter if you're coming in for hormones or doesn't matter. Gut health is so foundational.
I was surprised. Like, that's where it all begins. And that was a big, I think, turning point for me, sitting down with you and kind of walking through all of that. So I really appreciate that your focus is so steadily there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, like you said, like you probably weren't super symptomatic gut wise, right? People
Right.
come in, they're like, "Oh, my gut's fine," but then we start to be a little more probing, and we're like, "Okay, kind of list a handful of symptoms. Like, do you ever have these?" Like, "Oh, yeah, but only sometimes it doesn't interfere, like you Kala said, with their life too much." So I have one of my family members, the dairy. He's like, I just know it's gonna ruin my day tomorrow," but like they'll just continue
Right.
to do that because he's like, "I'll just live with that consequence," and we're like, that constant inflammation and burden, like over time, there are consequences to our actions, right? The
Right.
consequence may not just be the next day, long term, but
It's amazing what we can get used to.
yeah. So when we talk gut health, we're not just talking digestion because your gut has such an significant role in the immune system. I know we've said this before, but like 70-80% of your immune system actually is in the gut. It's associated through something called gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT. So every time you eat, your immune system is evaluating what's coming in, what's safe and what's not. Your microbiome can shift. Every time your gut lining is compromised, your immune system is involved. The biggest job your body does every day is digestion and figuring out what to do with what you're putting in your body. So that's why we would talk about fasting and stuff, why there's so many benefits from your gut and your health is so crucial. But that gut lining is in your small intestine is made up of a single layer of cells. So, I mean, that's not a lot, right? We're not
Right.
working with lots. Once we're damaged, we get some consequences there.
Sure.
And it's connected by tight junctions. So they're very specific. They can open and close based on signals of what's coming in. And the key part of this, and we've talked about leaky gut before, those cells are supposed to be really tight together. They're called
Right.
tight junctions. They're supposed to be really close. So only when you eat your food, you have a whole food particle, digestion happens, it gets broken down all the way into vitamins and minerals, and then those small particles are what's squeaking through into your bloodstream. But when we have this breakdown and this intestinal permeability called leaky gut, that gut lining is not doing its job. We have these big gaps now in between these cells, and now whole food particles can get through. And your body wasn't designed to have whole food particles in your
Right.
bloodstream. So that's what's kind of fueling when we do our IgG food sensitivities is what we do in our office most commonly. So when we have that happening, it can have a myriad of symptoms. So some people, the classic gut discomfort, bloating, digestion, things like that. But like if I eat too much dairy, my muscles and my shoulders hurt. Like that's my reaction
wild.
to it. So you know how many years it took to put those two things together?
Right, connect
I was
the
like, I
dots.
just carry my stress in my shoulders.
Right.
So
That's funny.
that's why like when I had to eliminate dairy for one of my kiddos, and because I again, never had connected those symptoms. I was like, this is crazy. But very different symptoms that can happen. So that's why I like the food sensitivity test, because it can really help pinpoint. You wouldn't even know that food is causing these other things, or migraines and things like that. But your gut needs to allow your nutrients, your amino acids, vitamins, minerals, all those good things to pass through while keeping out the bad things, your toxins, your bacteria, the large food particles we talked about. But when that barrier becomes compromised, you can have endotoxins. So basically it's like bad waste from bacteria that can leak through, and that causes inflammation. The immune system reacts to that very aggressively. It's highly inflammatory, and that can trigger these transcription factor protein complexes. Basically, there's a master regulators of your innate immunity, and that leads to chronic inflammation, autoimmune diseases, cancer development, like Kala talked about. So it's pretty crucial that we just don't have ongoing inflammation all the time. There's a study from 2007 showing that even small increases in that LPS can lead to an increase in inflammatory cytokines, insulin resistance, and fat gain. So we're not just talking gut, we're talking metabolism, hormones, which Kala will get into in a little bit, energy. All of those things are really crucial. Another aspect is your gut bacteria also regulates inflammation. It's actually the bacteria you have in your gut. So good bacteria, because we talk about oversimplification, but you got good guys and bad guys in the gut, right? The beneficial guys, the good guys, are going to produce short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which is so crucial. It fuels your colon cells and strengthens that gut barrier, but it also inhibits inflammatory pathways. So if you don't have good bacteria producing these short chain fatty acids, you're now not getting those anti-inflammatory protections, right? So when those are depleted, and that can be due to antibiotics, processed food, stress, environmental burdens. We live in Iowa. There's a lot of things going on around us. So we can't limit all of those things, right? But we just have to do what we can. But when we have those and those good bacteria depleted, now we're losing all of those beneficial things. Another key piece that I think is not talked about a ton is like the gut-liver axis. So you have toxins and hormones that are processed by your liver. Those are then excreted into your bile. that goes into your gut, and then you need to eliminate it. But if your gut's not working well, then that
Right.
elimination is not happening, right? So enzymes like beta glucuronidase really allow those toxins and hormones to just recirculate. So you then now
kinda
have more,
scary.
yeah. So you have more inflammatory signaling, and that can contribute to PMS, heavy cycles, mood swings. So even if like looking at labs, estrogen levels aren't elevated, it's just that non-clearance that's happening that can make that inflammation be driven. Just
So to simplify though, kind of what you're saying, we're reabsorbing the waste we were supposed to excrete improperly, and we were not absorbing the vitamins and minerals we were meant and intended to have from that metabolic function
Right.
standpoint.
So you're loading up on all the toxins, and that's keeping your body from absorbing the things that it needs to.
Yeah.
Boy, that increases the fear factor.
It does. And then too, so we can do a lot of really cool functional testing, but then the ultimate question is like, but what's the root cause of this? Why would I not be producing enough short chain fatty acids, or why would I be having a malabsorption or a maldigestion issue? And sometimes to overly simplify, it's because we're so busy. We're not smelling our food. We're not looking at our food.
Wow.
We're not chewing our food. And so sometimes like the very basic metabolic things that God created us, like this design on purpose, when we produce saliva from smelling or salivating and looking at our food, that saliva release then tells our brain to tell our stomach cells, start producing acid. So there's a lot of metabolic things that we as busy humans, especially busy humans living in first world America,
Right.
that like we are the problem. So we
Indeed.
can do a lot of cool functional tests, but sometimes, for the listeners and the viewers, take some time to like smell your food, look at your food, especially while you're preparing it, because that can stimulate a lot of the proper gastric juices to have proper digestion and elimination in the first place.
That's powerful. And I love that, we were starting to kind of press into that hormone conversation, because I think that's one of the main things people are talking about right now. A lot of people know when something feels off hormonally, whether it's, a cycle, energy, mood, but they don't always hear it in the same conversation as inflammation. And what we're really seeing is that these aren't separate issues. They're connected. And so, Dr. Calla, can you walk us through just a little bit more of that, how inflammation is actually influencing hormones, metabolic health on deeper levels?
Yeah, absolutely. So inflammation and hormones are so connected. One of the most important areas for women is as it pertains to ovulation. And so, too, for our listeners, sometimes there is obviously a biological and genetic difference between men and women.
Amen.
Sometimes,
Praise God.
yeah, praise God, amen. He did not screw it up.
Right.
This was by design on purpose. So sometimes I tease my males and females because my males, they are not as different metabolically every single day. Their hormone levels
Right.
are very planned, and they are more on a 24-hour cycle, where women, depending on where we are at, we have our early years, and then we have our adolescence, and then, the motherhood years, and then perimenopause, menopause. And so women go through different seasons
Wow.
of where we're at in our hormone cycle. But in women who are ovulating or having cycles and bleeding, we are different metabolically every single day, because our estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, it really varies on where we're at in our cycle, varies where we're
Right.
at nutritionally. And so that's why there's a lot of nuances that are difference between men and women. And it's because women are great. We're created very differently.
Right.
And so that should be observed. But oftentimes men are like, yeah, I didn't notice any difference. And it's like, well, that's great, because you're the same human every 24 hours.
Right.
Where women, it's like, well, where are we at? Are we on day 5 of our cycle, day 14 of our cycle? Because we are chemically very different. And again, there's no shame in that. God had a plan. So with that, one of the most important areas about how inflammation and ovulation are connected. If inflammatory biomarkers are elevated, the body may downregulate ovulation, because ovulation requires energy, stability, and signaling precision. And when ovulation is disrupted, progesterone drops, and conversely, if there's a ton of inflammation, that might be the cause. So we kind of have some synergies here on, if is ovulation disrupted, so then that's messing with the progesterone, or is it because we don't have enough of the building blocks to make progesterone? Like we're not getting adequate sleep, we're not getting a lot of dietary, we're very iron and ferritin deficient. So again, we can see a lot of biomarkers that tell us progesterone is low, ovulation is low, doesn't really tell us the root cause of why, because of how uniquely complex and perfect God made women.
Right.
So progesterone has very anti-inflammatory, very calming effects. GABA has a lot of connection with progesterone and what we call it calming the brain, and it stabilizes the effects of the uterine lining and is essential for sleep. And we have a lot of correlation between progesterone and estrogen. The first half of women's cycles, progesterone and estrogen are relatively quiet. Then we'll get right before ovulation an estrogen spike, and estrogen is usually more pro-inflammatory. That's why the Women's Health Study they talked about years ago, they said that's why women shouldn't be on hormones. That's why hormones are so reckless. Well, it's because they didn't interpret the study accurate, which is first and foremost. Two, it was never commonplace in conventional healthcare to test women throughout our entire cycle. So we'll have very highly educated, very passionate OBs and conventional medicine doctors saying hormones don't matter. You're different every day. We can't test you. That's where now functional medicine and integrative medicine for some, like honestly, I know providers that have been doing hormones for 20 years, but 20 years ago they were called quacks and being reckless, and some of their licenses has been called into question. But it's really about truly understanding where women are at, understanding what is their progesterone relative to estrogen and where they are at in their cycle. But low progesterone allows for more of that inflammatory cascade. We're going to see sleep worsening and moods become more unstable. So then there starts kind of a cascade of this hormone disruption. Now, though, transitioning to thyroid and the thyroid connection, inflammation also affects that. The thyroid produces mostly T4, which is inactive, but must be converted into a more active T3, and the inflammation can impair that conversion. Cortisol can also impair that conversion. Cortisol can set at the binding site of T4. So then we're going to if that cortisol is sitting there, that's going to inactivate that T4, so then we can see disruption there. But this conversion relies on enzymes that are sensitive to inflammation, so that cortisol stress hormone, and then the nutrient status, such as zinc, selenium, iron, and even iodine. Now, again, inflammation can convert this conversion to reverse T3, which is inactive. A lot of times I'll have patients tell me that their provider said reverse T3 doesn't even matter. It doesn't even make sense on why that was run. We like running it because when we have a hyper elevated reverse T3, that tells us either a chronic inflammatory burden that we haven't identified or potentially a low level untreated infection. So sometimes we'll see some yeast, funguses, or bacterial overgrowths. And again, that's why it's so important to also consider our GI health, about what's going on there. But we can't talk about inflammation without talking about metabolic health. So sometimes we say the metabolic health, patients will ask, like, what does that even mean? They kind of hear metabolic, so they think metabolism.
Right.
That's a part of it. But metabolism, cancers have a very aggressive metabolism. Sometimes, not all the time, but all disease has a metabolic function. So the more our type 2 diabetes or our hypertension and cardiovascular disease, that's kind of an indicator of how metabolically healthy are we. And we don't want to facilitate more metabolic dishealth or disruption or dis-ease, but inflammation is one of the biggest primary drivers of insulin resistance. So the best way and the easiest way I like to describe insulin resistance, if all three of us sitting here ate an apple, we would want our pancreas to squeeze out a little bit of insulin to get our blood sugar, because apple is a very healthy, nutrient-dense fruit, especially if it's organic and no pesticides on it.
Right. Amen.
But all three of us could have it, and our pancreas could have all three different reactions. What we want is that it's just the minimal amount. But sometimes if we're full of inflammation, we're not sleeping, and we have hormone disruption, is what happens is that pancreas has to squeeze out a heck of a lot more insulin in order to get that. So that's kind of that fuel to then more inflammatory cascade, more inflammatory cytokines that interfere with insulin receptor sensitivity, making it harder for glucose to enter the cell. So the body is going to compensate by producing even more insulin and exhausting. We have adrenal exhaustion or adrenal fatigue. We get pancreatic exhaustion as well.
Wow.
Over the time, this leads to elevated insulin, fat storage, especially in the visceral fat, and then energy crashes. So this visceral fat and inflammation loop. Visceral fat is the metabolically active. It releases even more inflammation cytokines, creating this feedback loop. Insulin we increase inflammation, we increase that insulin resistance, we increase fat storage, and then it just now produces even more
Wow.
inflammation.
It's quite a cycle.
It's like
a horrible circle.
Quadruple negative. And then what happens as inflammation, it also increases our oxidative stress, which damages the mitochondria. Why we care about the mitochondria? That's our energy, the mitochondria, the producer of the ATP. So basically, now we're taking your car, your body is a car for this analogy. Let's assume your car gets 100 miles per gallon. Well, the more damage, the more inflammation, and the more mitochondrial dysfunction. Now we've taken your 100 miles per gallon car, now you're 20 miles per gallon.
Wow.
You're still operating, but way less efficient, which means then you need even more nutrients in order to recover. So the more that occurs, the more inflammation and oxidative stress, we're going to see energy production from your own body, from your own fuel is going to drop. Your fatigue is going to increase and your recovery is going to slow. So that's why people say, I'm doing everything right, but I still feel exhausted.
Yeah, I think this is where the conversation becomes even more real for people, because when we talk about hormones, we're not just talking about how someone feels day to day, we're also talking about function. And one of the clearest reflections of overall health and hormone balance is fertility. So for both men and women, Brittany, can you talk to us about how inflammation is impacting fertility on both sides of that equation?
Absolutely. So fertility is one of those most sensitive indicators of overall health. We like to call it like the fifth vital sign. There's actually a book called The Fifth Vital Sign. I highly recommend it for women to read. But in order for your body to support the reproduction, it needs stable energy, balanced hormones, low inflammatory burden. You need to feel safe, essentially. Like your body is made to create life, but if it's not a good environment, it's not going to happen.
Right.
So when that inflammation is elevated, it essentially perceives the conditions are not ideal for reproduction. Like if we can go back to in the older days, like be like, okay, if our body is super stressed, why would it want to create more life to add more stress?
Right.
So that's why commonly when we have patients come in for fertility concerns, we'll run food sensitivities on them. It's like they may not eat, they might not have any gut concerns at all, but we're like, if we can lower our inflammatory burden, diet is one of the easiest way we could do that. That's just going to increase our chances, right, of like calming down inflammation, increase fertility. So we do that pretty commonly, and very, very rarely do we run a food sensitivity and nothing come back. There's always some layer of inflammation and response to things. So. But in women, inflammation affects fertility at multiple levels. So I know Callie already talked about ovulation a little bit, but it disrupts the signaling between the brain and the ovaries. So you have either delayed ovulation or no ovulation or weaker ovulation. And what we mean by weaker ovulation is it's still happening, but you're not getting that robust peak of the progesterone after ovulation. And it's crucial. You need progesterone, not just for maintaining your pregnancy, but it helps prepare the uterine lining. It supports implantation, stabilizes the early stages of pregnancy. So if we have someone who is clinically low in progesterone, that would be something, and they're having a hard time sustaining a pregnancy. Getting on a progesterone support would be helpful under the guidance of a practitioner, of course, but to help get them to sustain a pregnancy. Sometimes that's the missing piece. And unfortunately, if you are in conventional medicine, you'll have to have 3 miscarriages before they'll do anything about it. So that's why I like to talk about it a lot, because we've had a couple patients who luckily they just were aware that functional medicine exists. I don't think some people just don't even know. And
it's
she's
a
like,
conversation. The more I have it, you get a look from people like, oh, what's that? And I'm like, well, you need to talk to these ladies.
But if you don't know that, then you unfortunately just have to go down that road of, having a couple miscarriages before they finally are like, okay, now we'll look into what's wrong. I had a patient who was aware of it. She's like, had one. She's like, my doctor said they wouldn't do anything until I had 3. So I came, I'm coming to you. We ran our labs and there was a lot of things we could optimize that would, so I'm so glad she knew about it and didn't waste, a bunch of times and a lot of heartache before she was able to get support. But another thing, and when we talk fertility, is egg quality. So egg cells are highly dependent on your mitochondria function, like Dr. Kelly talked about. Inflammation increases oxidative stress. So mitochondria need low stress so they can just function well. So that impacts egg quality, fertilization potential, development of the egg. So there's research showing that oxidative stress plays a major role in reduced fertility and poorer IVF outcomes. Another thing is like the uterine environment. Again, this is where those food sensitivities come into play. Inflammation. It can also affect that lining. So we can see, again, impaired implantation, increase the risk of miscarriages, conditions like endometriosis, which are very inflammatory in nature. And those are very complex, and maybe we'll do an episode on that sometime. But
She
And
bring
then-
Brooke in. She had quite the years and years of
Mhm,
experience
mhm.
there. That was rough.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's something we hear, and Brooke
Yep.
probably had to work through it all on her own.
It took years to get to people who knew what they were talking about. Yeah. And by then it was kind of too late, actually.
Well, and then there's like the consequences of like the chronicity of stress, the heartache, the sadness,
Yeah.
the feeling broken when you're not broke. They just didn't get to the root cause.
Right.
hmm
Yeah.
Another aspect that we kind of touched on already is estrogen and clearance. So if estrogen isn't being properly cleared due to your gut or your liver dysfunction, it can create more inflammatory burden. So that's kind of sums up like the women's fertility aspect, but fertility is not just about women. And luckily this is becoming more common that men are also in this conversation.
Yep.
It's used to be overlooked, but I feel like it's, there's part of it now. But inflammation affects male fertility as well. So sperm quality, that again, oxidative stress, it can affect the sperm DNA, the motility, so how well it's moving, the shape and the structure of the sperm. Oxidative stress, there was a review that says it's one of the leading contributors to male infertility.
Wow.
It can also affect testosterone, is associated with lower testosterone levels. So those inflammatory cytokines we talked about can suppress the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. That regulates your testosterone production. So we see low testosterone, reduced sperm production, decreased libido and performance. And so that's not what you need when you're trying to make a baby.
Right.
So for both men and women, fertility is not a separate issue. And I don't think a single thing we've talked about on this is a separate issue.
Right.
It's all so intricately connected. But this lets us know how is our metabolic health, hormone health, inflammation, the whole system functioning. So this is why you can't simply target fertility without talking about, gut health, inflammation, all of it.
I think that really puts things into perspective, because fertility isn't just about one system. It's a reflection of how everything is working together: energy, hormones, inflammation, all of it. And even for people who aren't trying to conceive, it still matters because those same processes influence how we feel, how we function, and how we age. And so, Dr. Kalat, talk to us about how this actually shows up maybe more broadly and what you're looking at from a lab standpoint to start putting those pieces together.
Sure. So the thing about functional medicine and integrative medicine, it is always really important for the provider to gather like as much of a health history as humanly possible about what the patient's goals are and any current symptoms, and then current or previous symptoms in their history, as well as maybe some family,
Sure.
concerns. And then it's also important for the clinician to age appropriate, like at what age is the patient. And so, in our clinic, we see this spectrum of, adolescents to patients that have been in retirement for 10 years, but still just want to feel better. And so
Yeah,
it's really
that's
important
awesome.
for us to not just chase ideal and optimal. It's important for us to put it in perspective of what are the goals of the patient, what are their symptoms, and then age appropriate for those different ranges.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And so a lot of the times I'll get, because our office sees a lot of women, we'll talk about libido. And I'm like, how is your libido? And they're like, it's dead, but I don't really care about that. But I still think my hormones are messed up.
Right.
Or women will be like, well, I haven't had a cycle in 8 months, but I really don't want it back. And so a lot of the times when we talk about fertility, sure, we might age discriminate or age associate based
Sure.
on appropriate procreating of like, you want to start a family. But for women, 35, 45, 50 and above, it's like, I don't want to have another
Right.
baby. Don't make me more fertile or hyper fertile. So that's like a
get
really,
it.
a genuine concern for that. But at the same time, as Brittany was talking about, a period and period quality is a vital sign. Libido and desire and drive is also really important. And so as it pertains, as you listen to some of that from a fertility standpoint, I want patients to be fertile as long as God wants them to be fertile.
Yeah.
But we also know that God intended, as we're observing, menopause is a thing and allows women to enjoy being a grandma
There you go.
without having to raise kids. But okay, so we continue, as it shows up in labs. So clinically, inflammation is going to show up symptomatically from this fatigue, brain fog, weight gain, poor sleep, multiple hormone imbalances, not just one, but we're also going to see this symptom-wise of lack of motivation, lack of desire, things that used to bring you happiness no longer does. We're also going to see a significant loss of skeletal muscle mass. So often people are told everything is normal, but when we look closer, what we're going to see is that high sensitivity CRP, or even just the basic CRP, which is that marker of systemic inflammation, non-specific. Fasting insulin, ideally, we really want our patients to be below 7, and there's a lot of metabolic reasons for that, but we'll have patients, oftentimes it's not tested, but I've had patients be up in like the 40, 50, 60
Wow.
range. So what that tells me is like, well, you're going to be type 2 diabetic. I just don't know when.
Right.
It looks like we might be there pretty darn soon.
Gosh.
Based on that. Homocysteine, this is a very biomarker for inflammatory cardiovascular, has a lot to do with our B vitamin need, as well as our cardiovascular. Ferritin is not looked at enough. They will be told that they have normal ferritin, but ferritin, when it's not looked at, ferritin is basically the transporter of iron. Why I care so much is because that carries the oxygen.
Sure.
Every single cell in our body needs oxygen. If we want to starve cancer, give it lots of oxygen. If you want to fuel cancer, make sure that you've got as little oxygen as possible and give it all the sugar you want.
Wow.
Yeah, it's such a cheap biomarker to run. Vitamin D, low levels are linked to higher inflammation. Our vitamin D, I can't say this enough. When you look at your labs, it'll say it's between 30 and 100. So if you're within, 30 to 40, they say you're fine. We really need our patients to be between 60 and 80, and you can see some of those inflammatory and cytokines and CRP go down as a result of that vitamin D. And then this omega-3 status, which is critical for this anti-inflammatory balance, especially if we want to live in the Midwest, have a lot of omega-3 or omega-6 consumption from our animal meat.
Right. I think for a lot of people, this is where things start to click because they've been told things are fine, but they just don't feel fine. And what you're describing is that space in between where the body's already showing signs, even if it hasn't crossed, kind of that standard diagnostic threshold. And one of the places that tends to show up pretty clearly is in the brain. So maybe lead us into that.
Yeah, so it doesn't just stay in our intestines or in our vascular system. It really, truly can affect the brain. And this is what we call neuroinflammation. Under normal conditions, the brain is somewhat protected by the blood-brain barrier. Earlier, we were talking about a leaky gut.
Right.
We can have a leaky blood-brain barrier, which acts as a filter, keeping harmful substances out while allowing nutrients in. Some professionals will say there's no such thing as a leaky blood-brain barrier, but we can test that and we can prove that. I don't like doing that. It is never satisfying. It's
Sure.
more disheartening than anything. But this does exist, and we can see this in adolescents, even in behavior issues and stuff like that. So, but under chronic inflammation, that barrier becomes permeable. These inflammatory cytokines like that interleukin-6, the TNF-alpha, can signal across that barrier, or in some can pass through and bring other neurotoxins and burdens with it, which then it activates the immune systems in the brain called the microglia. Microglia are essentially the brain's surveillance system. In short term, they're protective. They help clear damaged cells, fight infection, support repair, and when they're chronically activated, they shift more into an inflammatory state. And then we start to see changes in neurotransmitter production. So with neurotransmitters, those are think the brain hormones. We have the most common hormones that I think across the board, thanks to the internet and social media, people know about estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. But when we talk about neurotransmitters, those are the brain hormones. So think norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. We have ones that are excitatory and we have ones that are inhibitory. We need both. We need to have the balance of the excitatory ones when things are appropriate to get us excited, to keep us happy. But then also, in order to get into that rest and digest, we need those inhibitory neurotransmitters. So if we have inflammation crossing the blood-brain barrier, it's going to affect positively or negatively neurotransmitter production. It drives the tryptophan. So you remember at Thanksgiving, you might hear the comment, don't let the tryptophan get you down.
Yeah.
Turkey happens to have a lot of tryptophan. Tryptophan, as it down regulates, creates serotonin. Serotonin is that very helpful, calming, satiating. We feel joy, we feel happiness. And then serotonin then breaks down to melatonin, which is why we all want to take a nap after Thanksgiving dinner. But we can have those pathways disrupted and it moved towards a pathway called the chironine, which can contribute to then lower serotonin and mood changes. So again, it's all about the balance of the things that bring us joy, but then when appropriately, then we downregulate to things that make us calm, go to sleep, want to take a nap. But changes in these dopamine signaling or in these different pathways can impact motivation, focus, drive. And then again, it has a lot to do with the synaptic function. So how fast are those signals firing each other? If we've had a concussion or an untreated concussion, it can affect that signaling pathway. Another topic we can do has to do with endocannabinoids and how every single cell has an endocannabinoid cell receptor.
Wow.
So again, there's a lot of information and pros and cons about endocannabis or endocannabinoids. So thinking of our, what am I saying? The marijuana and
Right.
legal marijuana and stuff like that. And you can have cannabidiol and different things within the cannabinoid region. But again, all has a lot to do with the synaptic, how those brains and those neurotransmitters are communicating with each other, as well as how neural inflammation can affect with the brain. But again, these things, so many things lead to anxiety, depression, brain fog, and that motivation has a lot to do with higher rates of CRP and interleukin-6 have been linked to higher rates of depression. So again, chicken or the egg,
Right.
is it the high CRP and interleukin-6 or what's driving those to be elevated in the first place, then leading to the depression? But we're also seeing a growing research connecting chronic inflammation and cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease, sometimes is referred to type 3 diabetes or sugar on the brain.
Wow.
So mental health is not just psychological, it's biochemical. I shouldn't say just mental health, neurologic health, our
Sure.
brain health, which includes an aspect of mental health. It's not just psychological, it's chemical and metabolic and deeply tied to inflammation.
I think that's such an important piece, because for a lot of people, that's where they feel it the most. It's not just physical symptoms, it's how they're thinking, it's how they're feeling, how they're showing up day to day. And when that starts to shift, it can feel like it came out of nowhere. But what you're describing is that there's actually a physiological process behind it, which I think brings up a really practical question. If inflammation is connected to all of this, where do people start? Because there's a lot of information out there, and trying to sift through it on your own isn't always easy to do, which is why I love we're able to have these conversations. Maybe, Brittany, you can walk us down that road.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I think this is where people get stuck because they get
Yeah.
that information overload, or they look it up and one person says this, another person says that. Because they know like inflammation is an issue, right? Like one, most people know it negatively, right? So I'm glad we talked about the why we have it.
Yeah.
But you hear that term and you're like, oh yeah, but I don't know what to do about it. So sometimes people just try to get a little too aggressive about it. They'll be like, okay, I want to hit this hard, especially if you're like a type A personality or I tend to be an all or nothing kind of person. So I'm either
Yeah.
doing it all right or all wrong. So some people just, be like over fasting when their body's already stressed, or overtraining without adequate recovery. So if you're training really hard, but you're not giving your body that time to rest, like that is crucial. Cutting carbs or fat too low. That's especially for women. Men seem to be better about feeding themselves than women do, especially with the carbs and the fat. Or doing aggressive detox protocols, something you saw online.
Sure.
That some of these things are good, but if you're going to do an aggressive detox protocol and you don't appropriately support it, so as you kill off those bad bacteria, right, they're releasing those endotoxins we talked about, the LPSs, those can cause negative reactions. So you might feel 10 times worse
Right.
as you're doing it. And that's, again, we're releasing more toxins into your body. So like we're clearing out the bad bacteria, but we're having negative consequences. So if you don't do it with a practitioner who can kind of lead you to appropriate binders to take with it, and just diet and lifestyle things you need to do with the protocols, it's not going to be what you want it to be. And you may start it and then stop because you feel so bad.
Right.
So those types of things where you're really motivated to get after it, but it's really helpful to have someone to help you along the way.
Amen.
But if you're adding more stress to a system that's already overwhelmed, that can actually increase the inflammation. So the things that we need to do to just foundationally, number one, blood sugar stability. This is so crucial. When we talk about the things that are important, eating good food, rest, moving our bodies, sleep. Blood sugar is up there with those. It's so foundational. So we need to make sure that we're not having all these spikes and crashes throughout the day. That puts such a stressor on your body. So adding protein with your meals, enough protein. So we're not talking just a couple bites of chicken.
Right.
It's different. Everybody's body is a different size, different metabolisms. But for women, a lot of times we'll say start with 100 grams a day, or just track what you're eating, and be amazed that it's not even close to that. Unless
Right.
you're being intentional about it, it probably isn't. So men, will you need more? They say what, 0.8 per pound of is that what it is?
Kilogram per,
Yeah.
yeah. I just throw it out there. If you're an adult, start with minimum 80. A
Mhm.
lot of people aren't getting 80, but oftentimes we need even over 100.
Yeah.
Has a lot to do with how much skeletal muscle mass you have, not
Mhm.
necessarily. I'm biased. So the standard of care is based on your total body weight, but some people don't have a whole lot of skeletal muscle. So I use a reference like they're a skinny fat, their BMI makes them look good, but they're so low with skeletal muscle mass and, are luckily a size 4 or 6, like total jerks. But so they look healthy and they appear healthy. Versus like we can have somebody who's also a size 6, but they have so much more skeletal muscle mass. They are
Yeah.
going to require so much more protein. But the goal is to get people that have the same weight but such high body fat. We want them to burn the body fat but put on skeletal muscle to be more metabolically fit, metabolically stable as a result. So I don't like necessarily the cookie cutter, one size fits all, but at minimum, I haven't ever found if you're over the age of 18 needing less than 80 grams.
And
per
so I
day.
think sometimes people have a hard time figuring out where they're going to get that too. I actually
Oh,
was
for
having
sure.
a conversation on Sunday at church with an individual who is actually a patient of y'all's, and she was asking like, I need to take in more protein, and I don't know how to do that. I'm trying, and then I'm adding up my numbers, and I'm not getting anywhere near it. And so you try to share some tips, but I just said, well, you need to go back and talk to your providers too, because I'm not a nutritionist or a doctor. I can tell you how I'm taking protein, but we're different, and I think that that's what people need to understand is because we're all so different. What might be working for me isn't going to work for somebody else necessarily, and that goes back to that whole gut health conversation. When you start running what your body can handle versus what it can't. Boy, that was a real wake-up call for me too. I mean, the way that I was taking in protein before, I don't know that it was entirely beneficial until I cleansed my system of so much of that and then started to kind of walk back into, I think I get a lot of it from egg now, but we have so many chickens, it's easy to do.
Sure.
But yeah, it's got to be different for everybody.
But yeah, it's very individualized because I know there's all those high protein meals and a lot of them are heavy dairy. If you can handle dairy, that's fantastic. But for a lot of our patients, dairy is something that they unfortunately need to cut out for at least a small amount of time. And so adding in like protein shakes, you have to find a good source dairy free ones. There's ones that are full of a lot of junk. So sometimes that people will switch to something like, oh, I tried this, but because it has so many fillers, it's actually more irritating to them. So that's why we
found a good one. It's OWN, I think is the brand.
I think it's at Sam's, isn't it?
And
Yes.
down at the natural health store here, and it's a pea protein drink.
Sure.
It's maybe not as tasty as some of
Sure.
the milk based or casein based, but it provides I think it's 25 grams per bottle, and you throw that in with your mixed greens or whatever. Because I just try to blend it all together and get it over
Got
with.
the gullet.
Yeah. But there are ways to do it. You got to dig in and research that though.
Absolutely. Okay, so another aspect of like, okay, what can we do to help reduce inflammation on just like, broad spectrum? Gut health, we talked about this all the time, but if your gut is contributing to your immune system, triggering it, inflammation's not going to resolve, right? So adequate fiber is really important to feed those good bacteria so they produce those short chain fatty acids that are anti-inflammatory. So most people do not get enough fiber in their diet. So
For sure.
adding in high fiber foods if you can handle them. If you don't eat a lot of fiber, you got to go slow because you might actually feel worse. And so there's different types of fiber, but just adding those in slowly if you don't eat a lot will be really helpful. Reducing irritants, so buying organic when you can, just with where we live, that's going to help be helpful. And then just supporting digestion. So if you don't eat a lot of protein right now and you start to add in a bunch, it might be difficult on your gut, right? So some people will need to add in salivating more, so your stomach produces that acid on its own. If it doesn't, adding in some acid support or enzymes to help reduce your
digestive enzymes. Is that
the one we carry has the hydrochloric acid along with the enzyme, so it's kind of broad spectrum, covers all your
And
bases.
Oxbile to
Yep,
help
and
with.
oxbile.
Because it's funny, I was getting one online, and I stopped taking it. Brooke would buy these, and it's from a very respected
Sure.
and reputable company, but it would just wreck me.
Sure.
And then I started taking the one that you guys have, and it's amazing. I don't have that. So
Could be
Again,
nuanced. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, because we even some of our probiotics, like if we give it to somebody and they're like, this gave me way more gas, way more bloat,
Right.
I call that the poor man's SIBO test.
Yeah.
It's
Sure.
fueling that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So sometimes when people take a supplement, it's hard to determine, well, is it because it was a less than ideal, less potent, or too potent that you got either over the counter, or even if it's a good high quality physician brand like ours, it can still make people feel bad, but it does give us more clinical insight and nuances
Sure.
to them as well.
I love that.
Absolutely. And another piece is we talked about protein, but also nutrients. Inflammation resolutions is an active process. It needs nutrients, so amino acids,
Yeah.
omega-3 fatty acids, like we talked about. We need to add those into our diet, so we're at least trying to counteract all the omega-6s in our diet. Helps to calm down inflammatory signaling there, and the minerals like zinc and magnesium. We run a lot of labs. People are very commonly low in zinc and magnesium across the board. So those are things that, there's, you can get droppers. They're called like trace minerals to add into your water, things like, especially if you have a good water filtration system, that's great. Sometimes some of them are a little too good and then we don't
taking
have
everything
anything
out.
in
Yeah.
there. So that's an option to kind of add in some more support.
Right.
Another aspect that is super helpful, sleep, which is
I think people overlook this one.
They
They're
do.
They're firing on all these other cylinders and getting 4 hours or 6 hours of sleep and wondering why their bodies are falling apart. Yeah. I know
Yeah.
somebody that way.
We did a sleep challenge at our office for a week, and I failed it. Everyone else just it's one of those things where I'm like, man, I'm not paying attention to how little sleep I was getting
Yep.
until I was like, okay, I recently got a tractor. I'm getting like 6.5
Yeah,
hours of
that's
sleep
rough.
a night, and it's interrupted because my kids don't sleep through the night. And I'm like,
Oh,
okay,
boy.
so I'm like really need to focus. So I started to go to bed earlier.
Yep.
Started to start see my emails so late at night. It's so foundational for just one life in general, right? Like if I have a poor night of sleep, my next day generally is not going to be as great. But it's been poor sleep has been shown to increase inflammatory markers like the CRP and the interleukin 6. So sleep is one of the fastest way that we can actually help inflammation. It also helps our metabolism. It's so foundational to
Right,
help everything.
100%.
So just like go to bed earlier. Try to honor your sleep time. Have a
Right.
good nighttime ritual. Pray, read,
Yep.
turn your TV off, turn your phone off. If you did that and nothing else, you probably would see some
100%,
improvement
yes.
truly
Yeah.
just from that. Another thing, moving our bodies, but not overtraining. Regular movement lowers inflammation, but if we're going to be excessive about it or not allow, significant recovery, that can increase your cortisol and your inflammatory stress. And then lastly, nervous system regulation. So sometimes I talk about this with patients a lot where I'm like, if they're just like, they seem like they're just stressed and they don't know how to handle it, it's chronic stress keeps you in a heightened inflammatory state. But there are very simple things like breath work we talked about before. Literally just sit there, breathe good and deep. You activate your vagus nerve. It's going to help calm you down. Some of these things, sometimes things that seem too easy seem dumb to do. Like,
Sure.
it's like we almost want to make our lives harder on ourselves. Like, I want to work really hard for this. It's like, if you just sleep and move your body and breathe, like, those are all
self-heal
free.
itself.
Yeah.
Right.
And you don't even have to come see us. But so it's not just about removing the stress, but we want to improve our resilience to it. So that inflammation goes down. So just breath work, sleeping, foundational, eat, keep your blood sugar stable, try to eat some more fiber. Just the free things you can start to do today that would help.
Nice. I love that. I think one of the most important takeaways from this conversation is that the body's not working against you. And sometimes what feels like dysfunction is actually the result of the body trying to adapt to an environment that's been out of balance for a long time. And that applies beyond just physical health, because a lot of us are living in a constant state of input, stress, stimulation, pressure, and still expecting to feel at peace, to feel energized, and to feel well. But the body, and honestly people, we're not designed to function well in constant overload. And at the same time, we also know that in today's world, you can't always slow everything down. Different seasons of life come with different demands. Work, kids, responsibilities, those just don't disappear. But what we can do is be intentional about creating space within that, taking time each day to step away from the noise, to pray, to be in the Word, to read Scripture, to disconnect from that constant input, that state that we find ourselves in so often through the day, because those moments, they don't just ground us spiritually, they calm the nervous system. They shift the body out of that constant stress response, and they create space for the body to function the way that it was designed to. the body was made for rest, nourishment, movement, stillness. And when we return to those consistently, not perfectly, but consistently, things begin to shift. That's really all the time that we have for today. As always, I want to thank Dr. Calla and Brittany for being here and sharing their wisdom and their insight with us. If you'd like to learn more about how you can live a healthier, fuller, more productive life, you can go to our website, wholehealthlive.com. Scroll down to that section that says Meet the Hosts, click on one of their pictures, and maybe begin that journey to better health. If you'd like to maybe talk to us about a particular topic, something you've been interested in, something that you've struggled with, you can also email us. Send us, some thoughts at contact@wholehealthlive.com. Until next time, let me share a passage of scripture with you on our way out the door here. It's out of the book of Numbers, chapter 6, and it's just verses 24 to 26. It says, "The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace." Be blessed, y'all. We'll be back next week.
Thanks for joining us today on Whole Health. If you'd like to learn more about our program, have a question for our hosts, or want to find past episodes, just head to wholehealthlive.com.